Yeah. All right, back into it. Uh, the last thing I said was something to do with binding. So Knockout, the philosophy is different. Rather than binding your JavaScript to the view and binding out to all those events, you bind your view to the view model, or that JavaScript there. Here's a little bit of code to explain what I'm getting at. There, on the left-hand side, we've got some code to put two select drop-down boxes with on and off on the first one, and two different settings that you can set on one of our flow generators. And on the right-hand side is a little bit of JavaScript code. There's a little bit of Knockout in there. And what this setup here lets you do is define a drop-down that enables or disables the drop-down to the right. So if you see on the left, you've got two drop-downs. The first one is the EPR enable drop-down. And when that's set to off, you can't pick the mode for the EPR mode. And if it's on, you can. And on the right-hand side, you see there's our view model with two fields. First one is EPR enable. It's tied to the input on the left, the top one. And EPR mode is tied to the input just below that. So, like I said before, your view is bound to the view model. Your JavaScript is completely agnostic. It doesn't know anything about what the view is going to use it for. The way that this view is wired up, the value in the first dropdown is tied to the value in the view model on the top. Same with the second value. But also the enable state of the ramp dropdown is tied to the value of EPR enable. So when the user interacts with the input and changes it to a new value, the view model automatically gets updated. Knockout handles all of that for you. Once the view model updates, then the view updates with that. So the enable state of the second dropdown changes to enable. Also, if something other than user interaction causes the view model to change, like if you had an AJAX call and you get a callback, when the view model changes from that update, the view reflects that change. So this is the same code again. All of what you saw right there is possible with this amount of code. There's nothing missing really. I mean, aside from the headers and all that in the HTML, but this is it. All of this will allow you to have a user interface that does all that. We'll examine the view model class in detail real quick. These two fields, EPR enable and EPR mode, are just KO knockout observables. When you want to be able to watch the value of something change, you create a knockout observable. It's what gets returned as a function. You can't just read the value straight off the field. You actually have to call the function to get the value, or call that same function with a new value to set that value. For example, if you wanted to have the initial value of EPR enabled to be on, you would pass this on parameter to the constructor. It works the same way as if you're setting the value of EPR enable. So the first part here is the data bind for that first input. Use this data bind attribute in the HTML to specify how your view binds to your view model. The syntax is just view binding type colon expression. They're comma separated like a JSON would be, but there's no curly braces. This particular binding value ties the value of the input to an observable on the view model, in this case EPR enable. So when the user selects off or on, the view model updates and vice versa. There's a little bit more complicated things that you can do. For example, in the second input, the enable state of that input is keyed off of the value of EPR enable, but it's keyed off of this expression here that you see. If the EPR enable value of the view model is equal to the string on, then the value of the select is enabled. Otherwise, it's not enabled. And you'll notice that here I've specified that you need to use parentheses. The rule of thumb really is if you're using an expression to describe your data binding, then you need to use parentheses to actually get the value of that. When Knockout goes through and evaluates the bindings, if you've got an expression, you have to call it to get the actual value from the observable. But If it's just a regular field on that view model, you don't have to specify parentheses. So this control is enabled only if the observable or the expression is truthy. And I mentioned the parens there. The last part is ko.apply bindings. This is where your view and your view model get tied together. So by passing a new instance of your view model to the apply bindings function, Knockout will go through, parse your data binds, and wire everything up for you. And everything is bound together. This has to happen after the DOM is ready. That's the only way that Knockout can go through, scan all of the data bind attributes, and then apply those bindings to the whole page. So like a lot of the jQuery stuff that you might do, you have to wait until the DOM is ready before you can actually call this. You can limit your Knockout view to one single container element by passing that element as the second parameter to the apply bindings function. It actually has to be an HTML element. It can't be a jQuery set. So like I said, Knockout and jQuery are totally separate. So you can use jQuery to get a reference to your container, but you actually have to pass the real HTML element in as the second argument to your apply bindings.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So for the previous slide where you apply the view model to a particular element, does mean, well, the next one, you apply.
I got lost. Which one?
Well, anyway, you have the view model and you specify the element. So does it mean all the child of the element inherits the same?
Right. Yeah, that element, your container element, all children of that are part of that view. So when you specify your view in this apply bindings, yes, all the children in there are part of that. This expression that we have here works fine, but we can also write it as a computed observable, or Knockout just calls them computeds. What we can do is define a new field on our view model, and rather than using ko.observable, we'll specify ko.computed, pass in a function as the first argument, which will return a value computed based on other fields in the view model. So if you'll notice, this is the same, essentially the same code as in our expression. The second argument that I have here is the context of this in the body of the function. You don't necessarily have to specify it this way. You can also say var self equals this and use scope to keep track of your view model. Whatever makes the most sense to you for your programming standards, keep it that way. We'll replace that expression with a reference to our computed field on the view model. And like I said before, you don't need to use parens if it's not an expression. If it's just a field on the view model, then you can just put the name of that field. So the interesting thing about all this is, who's used Angular in the past? Are you familiar with obviously you're familiar with the dirty checking. There's no dirty checking in Knockout at all. Who's used Ember? So you know how you have to specify in your computed observables what fields you need to watch for the changes? There's none of that in Knockout. The way that Knockout works it out is it uses a totally different paradigm called dependency tracking. When Knockout's smart about its updates. So it uses change listeners rather than dirty checking in Angular. And it also works out the details about what those dependencies are by figuring it. All of those observables are proxy functions, and when you compute a computed, Knockout works out which observables it needs to subscribe to changes for automatically every time the computed gets re-evaluated. So here's another example just to kind of illustrate that. This view model is used to display tweets about either Knockout or Ember. This current tab here specifies which tweets we're going to display, and it also drives the UI saying which tab to highlight. And our UI pulls a service to pull the latest tweets from Twitter that are related to Knockout or Ember. When you define this field here, tweets, this computed, this function is immediately evaluated. And because the value of current tab right now is Knockout, it goes into the body of this code, evaluates this.current tab. Knockout notices that you call that observable to get its value. It goes into the next part of the switch. It gets the value of the knockout tweets. It's just an array. These observable arrays work exactly like you think they work. They're just observables, but they, rather than being one single value, it's an array of values. And this computed here returns either the knockout tweets or the Ember tweets, depending on the value of current tab. So in the first evaluation of this function, knockout binds to the current tab observable and the knockout tweets observable and keeps track of changes to those. If Ember tweets updates, then tweets is not re-evaluated because that doesn't change the return of that function. Here's a visual representation of that because I think it's easier to picture it when you have something to look at. So on the left is our view in blue with the 3 tweets that are knockout related. On the right is the view model with our 3 fields, our observables, the current tab, knockout tweets, and Ember tweets, and are computed in green. And the red lines denote subscriptions to changes. So when our poll returns and gives us a new Ember tweet, the Ember tweets gets updated, but nothing else in the view model is subscribed to that change. So the computed observable does not get reevaluated. When we get a new tweet for knockout, the computed sees that change. Knockout notifies that computed it needs to be reevaluated. It removes all of the subscriptions that it had previously because it doesn't know what it's going to run into when it reevaluates. Goes back through, determines the new return, and in the meantime subscribes to the changes to the observables that it needed to actually make that calculation. So in this case, it's exactly the same as it was before, the same subscriptions. And then finally, the computed returns and we get our new tweet. If the user comes in and changes to the next tab, then our current tab changes, which the computed is subscribed to. It removes those bindings again, re-evaluates what it needs to return, and in the process dynamically updates the bindings so that the next time something changes, it knows to change. So these subscriptions have updated automatically. You don't specify them at all. It only re-evaluates that function if it needs to. And then finally the view is updated. All right, that's the first part. That's kind of the theory. It's the basics. Are there any questions about that before I move on to writing actual code? Yes. How it knows to update the tweets? There's a binding in Knockout called click, where when you click on something, it calls a function in your view model. And in this case, the hypothetical code goes in, it changes the value of current tab from Knockout to Ember. And then once that change happens, Knockout it notifies all subscribers to that observable that the tab value has changed.
Right. Sorry, I meant how the subscribers know to update as opposed to not update.
How the subscribers know to update as opposed to not update? Well, the Knockout only notifies the subscribers if they're... Yeah, exactly. It only sends out the notifications to subscribers of a change to that field. So there's individual subscriptions from it's inside. It's not like one single all subscribers of all changes. It's individual. The computed observable subscribes to changes to current tab and to Ember tweets. So when one of those changes, it notifies. Yeah. All right, any other questions? Go for it.
So this automatic checking and all that, is it pretty flawless? Or?
There are some corner cases where it doesn't work quite like you expect it to, and I don't have like a great example to give you right now, but we can talk about it more after.
Also integrated testing.
What's that?
Testing.
Testing? Well, in general, because Knockout has separated everything out really nicely, when you write your unit tests, you're writing unit tests for your view model. You're not writing unit tests for your view at all. So if you totally rewrite your interface, your unit tests for your JavaScript continue to function properly. And your integration tests that take care of the UI side of it, those will need to be updated. But all your unit tests for your JavaScript can stay the same.
So you mentioned Knockout parses through the HTML to do the data mining, breaking up the trees, non-trees. Is that the only way to actually do mining? Can you tell using JavaScript to tell Knockout to do the mining?
I believe that you can, but it's not really, that's not the basic use case. The idea is your JavaScript is really supposed to be view agnostic. Your view is just a consumer of the information on the view model, and all of your business logic is in the view model. So when you make changes to the view, if you totally restructure it, or let's say you have a view for desktop and a view for mobile, they both use the same view model. And if you make a change to the logic in there, they both benefit from that update. All right. Let's just check on time. I've never done a coding demonstration live, so this will be a little bit exciting. All right, I'm going to talk to an app that I made up to keep track of budgets, because making money is fun, but spending it's more fun. All right, just make sure that's working. So this is the beginning of this. What I want to do is I want to be able to enter income items and specify how frequently I get that money. Once a month, once a day, once a week, and sum it all up and get a total amount for my income, and then use that information to subtract from when I put in my expenses. But I'm not going to bother getting into the expenses on this one. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make it, when I type changes in here, I want them to show up in the monthly total. So switch over to our code. It's a little bit hard to see because the screen is so small. Is anyone having trouble seeing? No? Okay. On the left-hand side, I've got my view model. It's got a little bit of stub code. And on the right-hand side, I've got my view. It's not really worth going into the details, except when I start binding things to it. First thing to do will be bind my view and view model. And I'm just going to leave it as the, it's going to take the view model is going to apply to the whole page, so I'm not going to specify a second argument. So I'm constructing a new instance of the view model that I have defined here. Knockout will take that, parse through the code, and wire up all of the bindings. Right now there aren't any, so let's add a couple. Just got specifying this field on the view model, item amount, and I will bind my input to that field. And also this text here. So now when I type 700, it appears on the right side. 701, same thing. It kind of sucks that I have to hit enter every time I want it to change. So I'm going to add a new view model binding, or view binding. I'm going to specify that updates happen after key down. This binding here makes it so that when you actually type out the text, it updates the view model immediately.
So that's a built-in thing.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yeah.
an updater,
That's built in. There's lots of other built-in view bindings.
And does everything go in data bind? There's no like data value? Or
No,
data
everything goes in data bind.
Okay.
So it's one single attribute that gets evaluated. There's no
There's not like a bunch of other
Right.
like Angular where
Right.
there's all these. Yeah.
yeah. This will parse as valid HTML5 because it's data dash and then something.
Yeah.
Whereas Angular might not. It might not validate as valid HTML5. So if that's a concern, this is something that you can use to your advantage. All right, so the next bit, we can type in this amount, but we can't change how frequently we get it and have the monthly total column update. So we'll go in our view model and define a new computed observable. Notice this time I'm not going to specify a second argument for the this, for the body of this function. I'm just using self. I find it a little bit cleaner to do it this way. I'm going to start by just having it return the value of item amount. And yeah, I'm not a big CoffeeScript fan. I'm not going to lie. All right. So right now it's just acting as a proxy. It's the same value. It's just getting returned directly. Change this up a little bit. Use a switch statement again. You know what? I forgot the item frequency. This observable field will be used to keep track of the dropdown for day, week, month, year. One of the nice things about Knockout is that when you specify these data bindings, a lot of it's been worked out for you. So when I say value on the select, it's the same binding, but it's treated differently because it's a different kind of input. So inputs, when you type in your stuff, like if you're writing it in jQuery, you would have to write, on keydown or whatever. Or if the value in the select change, you would have to say on change. This is all handled for you by Knockout. I'm not going to reload the page because it won't be interesting yet. But now our switch statement makes sense. And I'm just going to write one case. If I get a certain amount of money in one day, I'll multiply that by 365 days in a year to get all the money for that 1 year. Divide by 12. That's my day. And just return item amount in any other case. It's a new Mac. Don't judge. I'm not cheap. I said, God, I hope that doesn't pop up. All right, let's put 7,000 again. Switch to day. Now, it updated, but we've got lots of extra numbers that we don't need. Just put 12 in there, for example, just to show this is what it would be for a day. This is what it would be for a month. But that rounding thing is really annoying. So let's fix that. This is one of my favorite parts of Knockout. The actual data that you're displaying, that computed value, that's really all that the view model really needs to care about. The fact that it only needs to display with 2 digits is a view concern. So you can put that in the view and change our item monthly amount to an expression. this will turn that into a fixed value. First it'll show me nan or something. Yeah, there's an error because remember this returns the first, if this item amount is undefined, if I call toFixed on undefined, I get an exception. This thing's been popping up. Yeah, this toFixed of undefined. So I'll set the default value for my item amount first just to 0. You can see already it's formatting much better. What happened last time? Oh, I see. That's weird. No, that's what this is for. No, that made it worse. One sec. There we go. That's better. I'm not sure what the issue was, but here it is with all of the different parts of the switch statement. So this changes, the value of this item monthly amount only changes if item amount changes or item frequency changes. That's a live example of what you can do with what I talked about in the slide deck. Are there any questions about this before I move on to things that are a little bit more complicated? All right. This is the cool part. Oh.
So, Angular, like you were saying, in Angular, you would usually do that on the view model side. So you would, if you wanted to have one value that had decimals and one that didn't, you would have to have 2 versions of that. Whereas in this one, we just use one copy of the variable.
Yeah. I don't know Angular well enough to know if you can't do this.
Well, it has a formatter, so you can format numbers on the view in the HTML.
I see. So you can. There's other techniques you can use in Angular to do something like that. But with Knockout, this is just one example of one way that you can do it. Yeah, any expression that you put in here is just a plain old JavaScript. You know, it's JavaScript right through and through. So whatever makes sense for that. But I don't recommend putting anything, more complicated than this in your view, because if it's really doing some logic that either is going to get used somewhere else or is too much to kind of fit really in the margins of your HTML, just move it into a computed like I demonstrated in the slide deck. It makes more sense there and makes the code more maintainable. And you can test that computed with unit tests, which you're obviously writing, to make sure that all your code's covered in. Yes? That could have been it. It could have been that I was not casting to a number. I wish I would have tried to work it out, because we don't know why it's better now. But anyways, you get the idea of how you would use this functionality to create an interface like this. All right, so I'm going to jump forward a little bit. I'm just going to show a little tiny bit of this because I'm kind of running out of time. One of the view bindings that Knockout has is for each. So what you can do is, Knockout doesn't have templating. It doesn't have a templating engine built in, just like it doesn't have a selection library. But what you can do is specify native templates. So this, I've fast-forwarded in Git a little bit to get that line item, that one single line item, into a container. And I can put a data binding here to iterate over a list and use this code here, this HTML, as a template for HTML for a bunch of items in that list. If you look over at my code here, I've also done a little bit of reorganization with that line item stuff. A lot of it has been moved into a totally separate class, just because each line will be one individual line item object. And our view model has one field on it now with an array of with an array of those line items. On my view, I can specify that finding for each income items, it's that same field here, use this HTML and use each item as that will become the scope, if you're from Angular, the scope of this template here. So each of these income items has an item name, item amount, item frequency, which maps up to item name, item amount, item frequency. If you need to reference a parent, there's ways to do it, like you can say, $$ parent dot whatever. This is beyond what I want to get into with this talk, but with this small reorganization, we can use the code that we wrote in the view model for multiple items, and as we change them, they're all distinct from each other. The next thing we would want to do is add an item. I'm just gonna skip through a lot of this because we don't have enough time for it, and kind of just jump to the end. But this will give you an idea of what you can build with Knockout.js. This is just the starting bit. So you can go in, add event bindings to put in new items like YouTube royalties, and update those values, change them, get a total. If I open up the network monitor here, what I've done is I've set it up when you change values. It's debounced, but every time you change a value, it actually sends a request off to the server, and it tells it, this is the new thing, so that when you update, it's auto-saved. And the code that you use, let's see if I can just show that off. It's really simple stuff. You just define your functions in your view model, and for example, when you click a button, it calls this to add an item. When that succeeds, it pushes on to income items, which is changed into an observable array. So when that updates, the view updates. Only things that are subscribed to that update. If you delete an item, it makes that AJAX call. The income items, the observable array actually has extra features to remove items, a little bit smarter than the regular JavaScript array. So yeah, all of this code I've put up, if you want to take a look at it and get a feel for what you can do. It's at this URL here. I didn't have time to make it into a tiny URL, but you can go on, download the code. It's broken down into the different sections that I've gone through, so you can go through each diff and get a feel for what it's changing. But I think it's a good project to take a look at to feel like, how can I actually use Knockout to make a responsive UI and keep my code separated. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Any questions before I throw it back over to Trey?
So is there, because you have to define basically your structure for how you're going to use all your view models, and then you're defining all this stuff like Ajax. Is there anything that sits on top of Knockout that kind of gives more structure to your, if you have a lot of code?
I know that there's something out there called Hamlet, and I can't remember if it's just a templating library for Knockout, or if it's more of an organizational sort of library to do what you're talking about, to make Knockout into something a little bit more like a whole framework like Angular. Maybe you're familiar with it. When you were writing that Knockout code, did you?
I never actually wrote it.
Oh, that's right, you never wrote it. Okay, sorry to call you out, but yeah.
Have you ever looked at rivets? And if so, how does Knockout?
I haven't, so I can't answer that question.
I have one question. I think all the changes that you made that triggered some, recalculation of values and stuff started with some event that was, you type something or move something. What if, say, an Ajax call comes back and updates some value, and then it needs to push back, go the other way? Does that? Does anything
Yes.
do you say, trigger render or something like that?
No, you don't. It's just whenever that set function gets called on that observable or computed, then anything that's subscribed to it gets a call. It all happens in the same call stack.
Okay.
So you don't need to do anything special for an AJAX call. It just happens.
If you want to say make it so that when negative values happen, it turns red and reminds you of color.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of just the value, is that possible?
Yeah, you can either bind, there's a CSS binding where you can specify, let's see, I think you specify a class, for example, so maybe you would want it to be negative or error or something like that. Yeah, there's bindings for that. Yeah, I wish I could have gone into some more of the bindings. There's a whole lot, you know, text, CSS, input values, radio buttons like checked and that sort of thing. But I'm not going to list them all right now. There's plenty on the actual Knockout website. Plug that.
So how do you prevent that data bind equals from becoming like this big giant,
Well,
you know, with like 8 items?
that's
in
an
or
excellent
something?
question. I didn't get to get into it tonight, but you can specify your own bindings. So if you wanted to specify a binding that was more sophisticated than just text, or if you wanted to specify something that was just like,
It was like a class and some text and like a value. Or something.
right, you can define your own, you specify, oh, this is not the right one. At least it wasn't porn.
We just got trolled.
There we go. I'm such an awesome evangelist.
What was your decision to do this?
Well,
Away from whatever was there before.
what was there before was an amalgam of jQuery and not jQuery and Java programmers writing JavaScript. I mean, there's nothing wrong with Java programmers writing JavaScript. It's just methods don't overload, so don't specify methods twice. Yeah. So Knockout was a solution to tighten everything up, and we're slowly working through. The reason we didn't go with Ember is that we have to support IE8 and sort of some lower powered machines. So it can. The nice thing about Knockout is it's really clean, it's really tight, and it's really snappy. You don't have that problem of I've got 2,000 items and it's starting to chug.
Do
I mean,
you use it in tandem with like jQuery or anything, or are you using
Yes.
it as to like swap it out as to like eventually deprecate?
It's well, someday it'll be deprecated. But I mean, you don't have to use jQuery, but if we're grabbing things with CSS selects, it simplifies that part of it. And also the Ajax query stuff, that's all jQuery. So that jQuery has its place to smooth out some of those wrinkles. But if you're working in an environment where you don't need to worry about, like if you know document.get, query selector or whatever is going to work for you, and you know that you can use the built-in Ajax stuff with the browser, then you can just stick with that. You don't need to use jQuery at all. All right.